Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to SBAM's Small Business Briefing. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Operations, and I am joined today by my colleague, Jacob Manning. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. My name is Jacob Manning, and I am the Advocacy and Policy Manager with here at SBAM.
Jacob was kind enough to pinch hit today for Brian, who is otherwise engaged in another meeting. And before we dive into the stories of the day, I want to say welcome to one of our new members. They are an elite member from Farmington Hills, Total Health and Wellness Associates. So thanks for joining. And you, if you're not a member, you should be sbam.org/join. All right, so Jacob, let's kick off today's show with an update on the state budget. We are inching very closely to the start of the fiscal year for the state, which is October 1st, and it seems like the legislature really isn't close to an agreement here. Do you have any updates for us that you can share?
Yeah, so to let everyone peek behind the curtain for a second, when I was initially asked to come join the briefing today, I was a little concerned that we wouldn't have enough content to cover. But of course, the Michigan legislature always comes and delivers, and so even when we're in the dog days of summer, there is still enough to update you all on today. And really, what the big topic is in Lansing right now, and has been for the past couple of months now, is the state budget. You may recall in previous versions of the small business briefing that there was a deadline, a statutory deadline in place for July 1st. The statute in Michigan says that if a budget is not passed uh, by July 1st, then there's actually no consequences tied to it. The statute just says there needs to be a budget passed. And so we kind of blew past this deadline, and now we are nearing the end of August. If you've been following our Watchdog newsletter, and if you aren't, maybe you should, you can update that on your member profile. It's how we keep our members engaged on what's going on in Lansing politics, aside from the briefing. But if you've been following our Watchdog newsletter, you've been seeing a growing number of articles every week with headlines like Speaker Hall and Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks haven't met in 2 weeks or haven't met in a month or so on and so on. Um, the two sides have been, so at times downplaying and at times upplaying the disagreements between them. But there was a bit of a shift, a development last week, late last week, when Governor Whitmer pretty publicly said that she is inviting the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader to a meeting, which will take place tomorrow on Tuesday. So hopefully, after a meeting on tomorrow, we will have a little bit more to report. But until then, this is kind of what we know now, and this is where things stand. So a lot of the criticism that's been going around is that the House has not yet passed a budget. They've said for a long time now, since before the budget process even began, that they want to be deliberative in this process. They want to reduce the number of earmarks. They've kind of looked at the process on how budgets get passed in Lansing, and they want to reduce the amount of horse trading, as it's called. They say that the state's budget is rife with waste, fraud, and abuse, very similar to the rhetoric we see on a federal level, down at the state level too, is kind of what their tenor's been. So they're trying to slow down the process and really get a good feel for where the money is going in the budget. Over the last couple of weeks, the different House appropriation subcommittees have been holding hearings where they bring in the different sponsors of different legislative projects and they ask them to come speak to what the project is for and where the money is going. And they've said that if there's not anybody who's willing to testify in support of a project, then it's not getting money in the budget. So they've been trying to slow the process down, be very deliberative. The House has passed a roads deal, which was several months ago. Really, this roads deal pulls from existing state funding to create long-term funding to go towards roads. We know that after the state's bonding proposal ended on roads just this last year, there's a big shortfall in the money that's available to go to roads. Namely, the money that was pulled was from the state's economic development dollars, the SOAR fund, and mega credits. And we expect the road funding to be about $3 billion of the total budget. So this is a pretty big piece of funding here. The House has also passed a school aid budget, which Democrats aren't really engaging with right now. Now, what has the Senate done? The Senate has passed a budget, but they have not addressed the roads issue yet. The Speaker has criticized their budget for not accounting for the shortfalls in whatever road funding is going to be required, and also for not accounting for whatever budget shortfalls will come in shortage of federal funding following the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which will shift some funding around for what states receive from Medicaid. Where's the governor? Well, the governor has given her budget recommendations at the start of the year. She also has a roads plan, but it seems pretty clear at this point with how contentious things are between the speaker and the Senate Majority Leader that she's going to really need to be the force to bring these two sides together. There's a lot of press conferences between the speaker and the Senate Majority Leader, and they take shots at each other. A lot of back and forth, and I guess this is sort of what happens during a split government period when you have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. But meanwhile, you can kind of see the groups that are waiting for this budget start to get pretty antsy, especially schools who are starting now today. Many schools started their school year today or last week or will after Labor Day. Superintendents and other school groups are calling for a budget immediately, saying that they're going to have to start laying off staff, how much uncertainty there is as they begin the school year. And so now, as we see the governor is kind of stepping into this process, um, we're hopeful that we can get some uncertainty solved. And really, I think everybody is just trying to avoid a governmental shutdown, which is a partial governmental shutdown will happen if the state does not reach a budget deal by October 1st, which is the start of the fiscal year, as Sarah mentioned.
All right, so that is kind of that's a lot of update for a non-update with the budget, Jacob. Thank you. But one other piece of this puzzle is that the House took a vote last week on a constitutional amendment that would suspend legislator pay if they can't pass a budget on time. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned the House never failing to disappoint in the news area, and there was a good bit of political drama and theater in the House last week as the House put up what would be a constitutional amendment. It was HJR M, which, if passed, would put a constitutional amendment on the 2026 ballot. And the contents of this amendment would essentially be that if the legislature and the governor did not meet the July 1st statutory budget deadline that I mentioned earlier, that they would have their pay suspended until a budget was passed. And so this was an idea that was actually really thrown into the mainstream recently by current candidate for governor, Mike Duggan, who kind of is running on the idea that Lansing is mired in um, what's the word I'm looking for? Dysfunction and partisanship, and really needs somebody to come help unify and be a coalition builder, and wants to say that he's the adult in the room. And so if they can't get a budget deal done by the statutory deadline, then they shouldn't get paid. This is an idea that makes sense to a lot of people, and it seems to make sense to the Speaker of the House, Matt Hall, who put it up for a vote. Now, the drama really ensued with this when the Democratic caucus was trying to decide how they vote on this, because this is something that most members of the House Democratic caucus agree with. And it seems that the members of the House Republican caucus agree with too. But they were debating on whether or not they wanted to give Hall the win. So in a vote that would require 2/3 of the vote of the legislature, the vote ended up falling 4 votes short after a very long caucus session and split votes on either side. And really, this in the end will just probably make its way into some campaign ads when you see so and so didn't vote to end their pay cut if they didn't do their job and so on. But really, the pay cuts would not have gone into effect this year. It would have gone onto the ballot next year and would be for future legislatures, but still something interesting and evolving piece of the conversation that we'll probably be hearing more about if you're tracking the conversation closely.
All right, so you mentioned Mayor Duggan, and I think that's a good segue into our Election Watch 2026 segment. Last week, Mayor Duggan held an event pretty well attended. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so last Tuesday, Mayor Duggan held an event where he was really trying to tout the bipartisan nature of his candidacy. He held an event at the new Detroit Central Station, which was recently renovated in Detroit, a big investment project by Ford, which I think is another thing that he really wants to tout, being that he is the mayor of Detroit. And at this event, he had, I think it was over 800 attendees, and he had over 200 endorsements from various elected officials throughout the state of Michigan. And some pretty high profile names in there, like Mark Gaffney, who's the former head of the AFL-CIO. So really pulling together some of that labor appeal. You also have Mark Bernstein, who's, of course, the Democratic mega donor. He's also a U of M regent. Denise Illich of the Illich family, another regent, and a lot of other various city officials and regents throughout the state. And what was kind of interesting about this event is just the sort of disagreements that this has outlined in what's going on in the Michigan Democratic Party as we go towards 2026. Duggan, a former Democrat who is currently considered maybe a candidate to run for uh, governor as a Democrat, which was assumed, but instead he broke off and ran as an independent. The current chair of the Michigan Democratic Party, the day after this event, announced that they were essentially retaliating against anybody who had come out and endorsed Duggan, and that they were restricting access to the Democratic Party's voter activation network for all candidates who had came out and endorsed Duggan, which essentially this tool is really a database that candidates use for canvassing and phone banking and such. And there was actually a story in the Detroit News about this where they talked about Mo Beydoun, who's the Dearborn Heights City Council chair, who's running this year to be the mayor of Dearborn Heights, who essentially in the middle of his campaign, after he came out and endorsed Mayor Duggan, had woke up the next day to see that his access had been cut to the VAN, as it's called. And so it's interesting to see as this race shapes up. You have Democrats calling Duggan a Republican, and then you have Republicans calling Duggan a Democrat. And so just interesting seeing where the battle lines are kind of setting up for 2026 before the primaries even begin. Definitely going to be a lot of intrigue as we head into 2026. And I think a good time to promote that in the next couple of weeks, I think 2 weeks away now, we are actually hosting Mayor Duggan for an event in Grand Rapids. That is September 11th at 4 o'clock. And I think Sarah is dropping a link to register for that. If you're a VIP or elite member at SBAM, you have free access to this event. And if not, there is a charge, or you can upgrade your membership, of course. But really, the structure of this event is going to be a sort of town hall style where Mayor Duggan sits down with SBAM President and CEO Brian Calley. They really talk a little bit about some of the issues that are affecting Michigan before we kind of turn it out to the audience and invite some audience questions. So should be a good event, and is just one event in a series of 8 events that we're hoping to do. We've made invitations out to all major party candidates and the one independent candidate, of course, for who are running for governor in 2026. And we have invited them, and we're in the process of scheduling these events now, and we'll be hosting them throughout the fall and winter to essentially try and get some face time between our members and who will essentially be the next governor of Michigan.
Yes, Jacob, thanks for covering that. I know it's an important event, and we do hope that all of you will take the time to register. I dropped the link. We do have a new, I'm just going to mention this real quick. We do have a new, you have to create a new account if you haven't yet done that. So follow the prompt at the top of the screen when you get there, create your account, and then you can register. All right, so Jacob, is there anything else that needs to be on our radar for Election Watch 2026?
Yeah, so just two little odds and ends that I wanted to put on everyone's radar. The first was that former Speaker of the House, Joe Tate, I don't know if it had been covered in this program, but had dropped out of the U.S. Senate race, I think 2 weeks ago now, was really lagging behind on some of the polling numbers, and so kind of saw the writing on the wall early and left the race. Just today announced that he was going to be endorsing current Congresswoman Haley Stevens to succeed Debbie Stabenow to succeed Gary Peters in the open U.S. Senate seat in 2026. That's going to be an interesting primary to be certain. Um, Abdul Al Sayed just held an event last week in Kalamazoo with Senator Bernie Sanders, and so again, really seeing these sort of divisions in the party come into play as people are deciding who's going to represent Michigan in the Senate in 2026. Another thing that I wanted to mention was that was actually on the state level, and that is that current state representative Donnie Steele announced that she's going to be running for state senate in an open Senate seat, one of the Senate seats that was kind of redistricted after the court case that we had discussed way back earlier this year. There were a number of Senate seats that were decided to be a racial gerrymander and had to be kind of readjusted on the fly and don't go into effect until 2026. And one of those seats happens to be the one that Representative Steele is running for. The current incumbents who are in that district are both term limited, and so she is hoping to run for that seat. And what makes this really interesting is that Representative Steele, I think, won 51% of the vote in her state house race and 52% in the last two elections. And so really sort of a 50-50 seat, and is going to be one that I know that Democrats will be targeting for certain, and Republicans are going to be trying to find a new candidate to replace her in that seat. Because when you have an incumbent who has established themselves and has narrowly won some elections, it's pretty hard to replace them. And so as we go into 2026, we have the state Senate up for full election and the state House of Representatives up, and a lot at stake. And so definitely some of the pieces that are going to be in play in this next election, a lot to keep track of.
All right, let's move on to a Board of State Canvassers meeting from Friday. They met to discuss another ballot initiative. So tell us about this initiative and the decision.
Yeah, so it seems like we've been spending a lot of our time with the Michigan Board of State Canvassers lately. The most recent one was on Friday. We had already talked previously about the graduated income tax proposal, but this proposal that we were talking about this last week was a proposal backed by a group called Mop Up Michigan. Their aim is to for money out of politics in Michigan, and really their stated goal, what they've targeted with their initiative, is they want companies like they target consumers and DTE as their two stated targets. They don't want them to be able to contribute in the election process for different legislative offices that regulate them. Now, it's a bit of a misnomer because the Michigan Public Service Commission, excuse me, regulates them, not the legislature. But really, that's what they're trying to get at with this initiative. But we took objection to this proposal because when you look at the actual language, as is often the case, it really becomes clear that this applies to a lot more people than just DTE and consumers. It applies to people who are associated with DTE and consumers. It applies to contractors who have contracts with the state of Michigan totaling over more than $250,000, which they assume that if you have a contract with the state of Michigan over $250,000, that you must automatically be a big business. But we know pretty clearly from our conversations with members that anybody who, I mean, you can be a small business with more than a $250,000 contract with the state of Michigan. That's a pretty small threshold. And also subcontractors who work on those contractors are all prohibited from all sorts of political giving. There were a lot of issues that we saw and tried to bring to the board's attention. In the end, the board was deciding on a 100-word summary to best summarize what the initiative does. We feel that the summary falls a little bit short. It doesn't fully express the sort of First Amendment restrictions that would be caused by this ballot initiative in all sorts of ways, not just with those two big players in Michigan, but a much broader swath. But in the end, it's really going to be up for the voters to decide, because now this group is going to be allowed to gather petitions after the Board of Canvassers adopted new language unanimously, and then the petitioners can go out and start collecting signatures on that.
All right, in other news from last week, Jacob, you actually testified in support of a bill in a committee. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so an issue that we've been tracking pretty closely recently, there's been a lot of bills generally that we feel would really make Michigan an outlier for litigation. And one of these bills is House Bill 4582, which is a bill I testified in support of in the House Judiciary Committee last week. And what this bill aims to do is to address Michigan's premises liability law. So a little bit of background on this. For more than 20 years, I believe it was starting in 2001, Michigan adopted the open and obvious doctrine for premises liability. And what the open and obvious doctrine meant is that if you were a property owner and you had a customer uh, on your property, and let's say they slip and fall on a hazard, uh, what is determined if that person decides to bring legal action against you as a property owner, uh, it is first determined in court, was the hazard open and obvious to a reasonable person? And if it was, then the case would be dismissed. And this really reduced the amount of litigation that would come forward in a lot of these slip and fall cases, and provided a lot of stability for property owners. In 2023, that changed. The Michigan Supreme Court had two cases before them that, in conjunction, they essentially nixed the open and obvious doctrine and really brought a major shift to Michigan's premises liability law. Um, and they shifted instead to a new standard where they determine levels of fault and who was at fault in the actual injury. And so what this means is that property owners can be held liable and sued no matter how obvious a hazard might be to a reasonable person. And then judges will have to conduct a full fault analysis in every case instead of just tossing out a frivolous case at the offset. They have to bring it to a full jury. And so, with a lot of these lawsuit cases, these litigation cases, our concern is that this is going to bring about a lot more lawsuits. Uh, the court case seems to really pave the way for nearly every slip and fall case to proceed, which will result in more filings and more litigation. We think as a result of that, we'll see higher costs for property owners who don't even have a claim against them. They still have to pay their liability insurance, and that as more claims are made, premiums go higher. And we really stress to the committee that during this time, families and businesses are already experiencing pretty intense economic pressures. We talked about the uncertainty in the market. We talk about that quite often. We've talked about the rising costs of healthcare, year over year, double-digit increases in healthcare premiums. And now we have these insurance premiums going even higher too. And if you are a business owner who happens to have a slip and fall case happen in your business, then you have to go through the whole process. And that means that you get drawn away from your business. And that means that you have to be responsible for paying for an attorney or representing yourself in this case, which just does all sorts of things to take your mind and your physical body away from doing the actual work that you need to be doing, which is the work of your business. And so, particularly for high traffic businesses like restaurants and just small businesses who don't really have access to sophisticated compliance and legal teams, this is particularly worrisome. So we testified in support of House Bill 4582, which would establish some level of open and obvious. We're working with the sponsor on that bill. We're working with the chair of the committee and with a lot of other associations in Lansing to try and get on the same page here, because we're already seeing all these out of state huge law firms come in. They've got billboards all up on I-96 and are really advertising that if you have a slip and fall case, you should come to them. And so we want to make sure that Michigan is not the destination for premises liability cases, and that property owners are protected and have some sort of stability here.
All right, well, thanks for that update and for testifying on behalf of our members. A few shows ago, we did talk about the Trump administration's authorization of federal aid to Northern Michigan after that ice storm. Is there, do you have an update on the status of those funds?
Yes, and so like the budget update, the update that I can provide now is that there's still a lot that's uncertain. And so we had previously talked about that authorization of federal funds. And that was kind of to go towards emergency work and some repairs, but it was limited. And there was also in addition to uh, there was that bit of funds that were accepted, and then FEMA denied other types of assistance that were a part of the request. Actually, just this morning, Governor Whitmer uh, issued an appeal on that and asked FEMA to reconsider. And this was a press release she did with, it was bipartisan. It had Senator Peters and Congressman Bergman on it as well to ask that FEMA reconsider their initial ruling and try and bring some more funds to Northern Michigan. I think I read in this article, I'm sorry I don't have this statistic right on hand, but by state estimations, the economic damages of the ice storm in March were over $136 million. And so quite a substantial impact. Now, after that initial $50 million funds were approved by the Trump administration, there was a bill that had already passed in the House. It was sponsored by Representative Parker Fairbairn. And essentially, what this bill would do would allow a state level match up to $100 million of support for funding for Northern Michigan. And so um, that bill passed the House 107-1. You don't see a lot of bills pass with that level of support, but pretty much everyone was on board that after this disastrous ice storm, that there needed to be some level of support for Northern Michigan. Now that bill sits in the Senate, and you can start to see some of the Northern Michigan senators are starting to wonder why it's not moving. So there's a bit of a disagreement there. We had one senator who was saying that it needs more work and it needs to be discussed a little bit more throughout the committee process. And then another senator saying we need the aid now and to pull the trigger on that and to really get going with those aid payments. So we can keep people updated on that in the coming weeks. That's really where we stand now. Still a lot up in the air, particularly with all of the budget conversations going on right now, passing a $100 million supplemental. Who knows? Who knows where that lands and everything, but we will be sure to keep everybody updated when there is an update.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate you joining me today. We actually, next Monday's Labor Day, so we'll be back here on Monday, September 8th. You know how to find us in the meantime if you need anything. We'll see you then. Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you, Sarah.